What if being mentally powerful doesn't look the way you think it does? Maybe it isn't about having a photographic memory. Maybe it isn't about being the smartest person in the room. And maybe it definitely isn't about always having the right answer. Some of the strongest mental abilities are almost invisible. They show up in the way you question your own thoughts, notice patterns, handle uncertainty, and see things from different perspectives. In fact, some of the things you may consider weaknesses could actually be signs of a mind that is constantly processing information. But there's an important distinction. These traits don't automatically mean someone is a genius. They're psychological habits and abilities that can make your thinking more flexible, deeper, and more effective. So here are 8 subtle signs your mind may be more powerful than you realize. Let's start with the first one. Sign 1. You question your own thinking. You hear an idea. Someone makes a confident statement. Everyone around you seems to agree. But instead of immediately accepting it, something inside your mind asks, how do we know that's true? Then another question appears. Why do I believe it? And sometimes an even more uncomfortable question. What if I'm wrong? That habit is connected to something psychologists call metacognition. In simple terms, metacognition means thinking about your own thinking. You're not just thinking about the world. You're watching how your own mind reaches conclusions. You might catch yourself asking why you reacted emotionally to something. You might realize that your first impression of someone was based on very little information. You might even notice that you're defending an opinion simply because you've held it for a long time. That's a powerful realization, because intelligence isn't just about producing answers. It's also about examining the process that produced those answers. Psychologist Carol Dweck's research on mindsets emphasizes that abilities can develop. So protecting the image of being smart isn't nearly as useful as staying willing to learn. A strong thinker doesn't need to prove they already know everything. They're comfortable saying, I don't know yet. And that small word, yet, can change everything. Because the goal isn't to protect your ego. The goal is to improve your understanding. Sign 2. You notice patterns other people miss. Have you ever noticed something changing before anyone else seemed to notice? Maybe someone's behavior suddenly feels different. Their messages become shorter. Their routine changes. Their tone changes. Nothing seems obviously wrong, but something doesn't add up. Your brain starts collecting tiny clues. One detail, then another, then another. Eventually, those details form a pattern. This ability is often associated with pattern recognition. Your brain constantly searches for relationships between pieces of information, and this can happen in everyday life. You may notice patterns in people's behavior. You may recognize recurring problems at work. You may notice that certain events tend to happen before something else. You may even remember tiny details because your brain connects them to a bigger picture. But there's an important warning. Seeing a pattern doesn't mean the pattern is real. Humans are extremely good at finding connections, even when those connections don't actually exist. That's why a powerful mind doesn't stop at noticing a pattern. It tests it. It asks, is there enough evidence? Could there be another explanation? Am I seeing a real connection, or am I simply looking for one? Pattern recognition becomes much more useful when it's combined with verification. That's when intuition becomes something you can actually trust. Sign 3. You can hold 2 ideas at the same time. Sign 5. You notice what you don't know. Here's a strange paradox. The more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know. When you understand one subject deeply, you discover more questions hiding underneath it. Imagine your knowledge as a small island. At first, The island seems enormous because it's surrounded by things you haven't discovered yet. But as the island grows, its shoreline grows too. And that shoreline represents the boundary between what you know and what you don't. That's why genuinely curious people often ask surprisingly simple questions. They're not trying to look intelligent, they're trying to understand. And there's a huge difference. Someone trying to look smart may avoid basic questions because they don't want other people to think they don't know something. Someone focused on learning doesn't care nearly as much about appearing intelligent. They care about becoming more accurate. That's why you might hear an expert ask a question that seems obvious. They're not necessarily confused. They may simply know that assumptions are dangerous. A powerful mind isn't embarrassed by the words, "Can you explain that? Why does that happen? What am I missing?" Those questions aren't signs of weakness. They're tools for learning. And this connects to a famous idea often associated with the philosopher Socrates. The more aware you become of your own limitations, the more carefully you search for knowledge. Real intellectual strength doesn't come from pretending you know everything. It comes from being comfortable discovering what you don't know. Sign 6. You can focus deeply. The sixth sign is the ability to become completely absorbed in something meaningful. You start reading, you start researching, you begin working on a difficult problem. And suddenly, you look at the clock. An hour has passed. It feels like 10 minutes. This can happen when you're deeply engaged with something that challenges or interests you. But don't confuse deep focus with intelligence itself. They're different abilities. Still, the ability to control your attention is incredibly valuable, especially today. Your phone wants your attention. Social media wants your attention. Advertisements want your attention. Notifications want your attention. Everyone is competing for a piece of your mind. And that's why attention has become one of the most valuable things you own. Think about it. You can have an incredible idea. You can have a great plan. You can even have a lot of intelligence. But if your attention is constantly being pulled in 10 different directions, you may never turn that potential into something useful. A mentally strong person learns to say, "This is what I'm focusing on right now." Deep focus doesn't mean you never get distracted. It means you can return your attention to what matters. And that skill can be trained. Start with one task. Remove unnecessary distractions. Give yourself a clear goal. Then stay with it long enough for your brain to move beyond the surface. Because sometimes the best ideas don't appear during the first 5 minutes. They appear after you've stayed with the problem long enough to see what other people missed. Sign 7. You connect ideas from different worlds. Here's a fascinating mental ability. You learn something in one area, and suddenly you see it somewhere completely different. You study psychology and recognize a pattern in business. You study biology and discover an idea that applies to technology. You read history and suddenly understand something about human behavior. This kind of thinking is often called analogical reasoning. You're not simply collecting information, you're connecting structures. You're asking, where else does this same idea appear? That's why curiosity is so powerful. Imagine your brain as a observe your own emotions. Sign 8. You can observe your own emotions. The final sign may be one of the most important. You can notice what you're feeling without immediately becoming controlled by it. You're angry, and instead of instantly reacting, you notice, "I'm angry." You're anxious, and you notice, "I'm worried about what might happen." You're jealous, And instead of pretending you don't feel it, you become curious about where the feeling came from. That's emotional awareness. Psychologists Peter Salovey and John Mayer helped develop the modern concept of emotional intelligence, including the ability to perceive and understand emotions. And there's an important difference between experiencing an emotion and automatically obeying it. Your emotions contain information. But information isn't always instruction. Anger may tell you that something feels unfair. Fear may tell you that something feels uncertain. Jealousy may reveal something you deeply want. Sadness may show you that something matters to you. But you still get to decide what happens next. Think of emotion as a signal. You can observe the signal without immediately handing it the steering wheel. That small pause between feeling and reacting can completely change a decision. The bigger idea. So what connects all 8 signs? It's not memorizing facts, it's not winning arguments, and it's definitely not proving that you're a genius. These are habits of thinking, questioning, observing, learning, testing, connecting, focusing, reflecting, and changing when the evidence demands it. A powerful mind isn't necessarily the loudest mind in the room. It may actually be the quiet one, the person who listens carefully, the person who asks one more question, the person who notices a detail everyone else ignored, the person who can say, "I might be wrong," and then actually investigate. That's intellectual strength. And here's the most important part. You don't need to be born with extraordinary intelligence to develop many of these habits. You can become better at questioning your assumptions. You can practice focusing. You can learn to recognize patterns without immediately trusting them. You can become more comfortable with uncertainty. You can learn to understand your emotions instead of being controlled by them. And you can train yourself to change your mind when better evidence appears. Your mind isn't powerful because it already has every answer. It's powerful because it can keep searching for better ones. So the next time you catch yourself questioning something, don't automatically think you're overthinking. Maybe you're investigating. The next time you realize you don't know something, don't feel embarrassed. Maybe you've just discovered a new opportunity to learn. And the next time you change your mind, because the evidence changed, don't see it as weakness. See it as growth. Because the strongest thinkers aren't the people who never get things wrong. They're the people who are willing to keep updating themselves. Stay curious. Stay humble. Protect your attention. Question your assumptions. And never stop learning. Because the real power of your mind isn't what you know today. It's how much better you can learn to think tomorrow.